State versus Deaver is one of many cases you'll find in evidence law that offers a very different rule when we're talking about children and claims of abuse, whether sexual or otherwise. So in the context of statements for medical treatment or diagnosis for adults, we don't think it's relevant that a particular person shot the victim. So if a victim comes in, shot, stabbed, hit, etc., ran over with car, it doesn't matter. If an ordinary victim of an injury comes into the hospital and says, I was shot, it is highly relevant that the person was shot, because we treat gunshot wounds differently than we treat other kinds of wounds. However, if the victim of an injury comes in and says, John shot me, it's not at all relevant to the treatment who shot the victim. The identity of the perpetrator of harm is not relevant to how we treat the harm. The nature of the harm, the way the harm occurred, is absolutely relevant to treatment or diagnosis. Now, there's a difference, though, with child victims, however. And courts have held that for child victims, that it is relevant to learn the identity of the perpetrator, because understanding how this harm occurred to a child is relevant not merely to treating, or not, the treatment of the child is not merely treating this particular incident, but is preventing future harm that will recur if the child remains in proximity with the initial cause of the harm. Is this something of a stretch? Yes, it absolutely is. We don't think of medical treatment as sort of the well-being generally of the person. If it's, if for an adult, if an adult says, I was shot by John, we don't inquire, well, maybe this adult's going to be around John later. Maybe they're part of the mafia. Maybe we have to keep this guy apart from John, and take effort to do that. We don't tend to think about the health or the treatment of the patient, rather, beyond the immediate symptoms that the patient presents with. However, in the context of children, and no doubt it's because evidence law, as we've seen with domestic violence generally, takes special pains to make sure that things would otherwise not come to light in domestic situations actually are justiciable, because of getting the evidence in is a difficult thing in these types of settings for a variety of reasons. And so the courts generally really want to make sure that we're able to get the kind of evidence we need to get people out of harmful domestic situations. This is a stretch of the rule. The court says in the Deaver case that you read that these rules were written for adults, and we have a need to apply them to the special case of children. I think the drafters probably knew that children would come to the hospital. I think that the thought that the rules didn't somehow contemplate that is a stretch. But it's also the case that there's a very valid policy behind trying to establish a way to prove child abuse, sexual or otherwise, in a household, and that this is a very difficult thing to show. So Deaver shows us that courts have engaged in, call it a legal fiction, call it a reality, whatever you want. It's simply the case that courts are saying, in the interpretation of 8034 statements for medical treatment, that the treatment of a child goes beyond the mere condition for which the child presents, and it extends to the health and well-being of the child generally, and the identity of the person who perpetrated the harm against the child is relevant to treating the child's general health. And so therefore, in cases of abuse of a child, the identity of the perpetrator is in fact relevant for the child's treatment. That will not be the case for adults. This is something that the case law has grafted into the rule, and it's a pretty uniformly applied view that we will have a different rule for children than we have for adults under 803.